There's this video I've had on the back burner for about 3 years to cover that I am just now covering. Essentially, I planned on making a commentary on Snoman Gaming's video on NES games, essentially around the time I started, but then I didn't, and now I am. Now, the first thing I want to note is this video is not about all NES games, just some of them. However, that's going to make blanket statements a tad confusing at times, like here, for example.
So, what's the big deal with NES games? Well, at their worst, they essentially replicate the arcade experience in your home, which was designed to be overly difficult on purpose in an effort to steal your quarters. But now, since no money is involved, the only thing it wastes is your time. Oh, you ran out of lives. Sorry, guess you gotta start the whole game over now.
Now, games like that did exist within the NES library, I am not going to say otherwise. However, when I think of the most popular and well-known NES titles, I can think of several that didn't fall into that category. The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and Kid Icarus didn't even have life mechanics. Meanwhile, of the 3 games you have in the thumbnail, only one of them forces you to start at the beginning of the game if you lose all of your lives, that being DuckTales on NES. Mega Man and Castlevania had unlimited continues, and Mega Man's 2 through 6, along with Castlevania's 2 and 3, even had passwords, so you could pick up where you left off. Side note, why is Castlevania even in the thumbnail for this video, given you name drop it as a good NES game, along with Ninja Gaiden early in the video?
Right off the bat, I feel like 50% of you are thinking, now hold on there, Buster Bacon Buns. There are some good NES games. What about the Castlevanias and Ninja Gaidens? And yes, absolutely. In fact, I'm gonna talk about them, so don't steal my thunder, okay?
But again, if the games are good, why are they here? And for that matter, I also want to point out that he doesn't really return to either Castlevania or Ninja Gaiden at any point throughout this video. Seriously, he never talks about what makes those games specifically any good. Actually, come to think of it, he very rarely name drops specific NES games he's talking about. I could think of him mentioning the zombies from Ghosts and Goblins.
Developers used to be a lot more carefree with incorporating random elements into their games than they are now. Look at how the zombies pop up out of the ground in Ghosts and Goblins. It's like, hey, sorry you got hit, that's the nature of the game, baby. Sometimes they'll randomly chomp your legs off.
And side note, I don't accept that claim at all. Remember, The Binding of Isaac has consistently been an incredibly popular video game, despite the fact it's based almost entirely off of RNG. Loot boxes are randomized rewards, and they were incredibly popular in video games around the time this video was released, to the point where video game companies were fighting genuine legal battles over if they were allowed to include them in their games or not. Primarily because people were trying to determine if they counted as something else entirely based on randomness, that being gambling. And by the way, on your earlier claim of NES games at their worst replicating the arcade experience, maybe don't cite Ghosts and Goblins, given it was an infamous case of what TV Tropes dubs a porting disaster, and is widely seen as inferior to the arcade version, or even other ports of the same game for that matter. The other NES game that's talked about in detail is Mario 3. Here's him discussing it.
I beat Super Mario Bros. 3 for the first time on stream the other night, and man, it was super rewarding. I warped straight to World 8, and yeah, it was hard, but still felt beatable. I remember thinking there's no way you would see stages like these in Mario games today. It really puts your skills to the test. That Bowser fight was top-notch, but they also did a decent job of balancing punishment and leniency. Upon a game over, you start at the beginning of the world, but any airships or tanks are destroyed for good, so you don't have to play those levels again. And while you can randomly get sucked into the abyss by these omniscient hands, they actually are more helpful than harmful, since the stages are very short and reward you with a valuable leaf power-up. The only parts you'd have to play again after restarting are level 1 and 2, but after completing the fortress, it sets a new permanent checkpoint leading straight toward Bowser's castle. But even then, I found myself using save states after finishing certain stages, because in the interest of time, I didn't want to keep playing the same challenges I had already overcome. I probably would have stopped before finishing if I had to keep fighting through level 1 and 2 so many times. Not out of lack of ability, but boredom or annoyance.
Well, it sounds like it didn't do such a good job if you had to use save states, an entirely external tool, in order to make it through the game. Genuinely, I'm not entirely sure what your point is supposed to be here. You say that Mario 3 did a good job with game overs, only to then say that you had to use save states in order to avoid the consequences of getting a game over. It sounds like you'd much just rather have a system like, say, Zelda, where the only punishment for death is that you're brought back to the beginning of the level no matter how many times you've died. And if that is your belief, that is perfectly fine. You're completely entitled to that opinion. However, you're still trying to praise a game without that system while trying to keep that opinion consistent, and that's leading to some very confusing results. For reference, here's the next thing Snoman Gaming says.
I think this is why most virtual consoles have a save state function built in nowadays.
So they could easier work around a mechanic that you just said was handled incredibly well? I'm very confused right now.
Lives are the bane of my existence. Their sole purpose is to push back your progress as punishment for losing them. And I think this is the main reason people say that NES games were so hard.
Do you have anything to back that up? Because I can at least point to one counterexample off the top of my head. That being Screw Attack's old list of the top 10 hardest NES games. On screen were the 10 games mentioned in that video. 4 of them have unlimited continues, so it's not as if that appears to be a deciding factor when determining what NES games are difficult, or for that matter, why NES games as a whole were more difficult than games today tend to be. Well, okay, Fester's Quest is a bit of a weird one because when you die in that game, you do return to the beginning, but you still keep all your upgrades and items, so it's not as if you're restarting it. Fuck, I can even do a bit of an exception that proves the rule by pointing out the only time the fact a game had a limited number of chances was even mentioned was Double Dragon 3, where you only had 1 life to complete the game, which was excessive even by NES game standards. And even then, they also make note of the controls being bad as another reason why the game is on the list.
1 life. All you get is 1 life. I hate this game.
Double Dragon 3 is clearly the most difficult game in the franchise, and even though you got spinning kicks and throws at your disposal, your best hope is just to pray that your spinning kick will work. But chances are it's not.
Look at this!
Similarly, when the AVGN talked about Double Dragon 3, he made it very clear this wouldn't even really be an issue in the first 2 games. However, other factors exclusive to this one caused it to be a problem.
Now the big problem I have with this game is just that it's too damn hard. All you get is 1 life. 1 life. If you die once, you start all over again. Now I can get through the first 2 Double Dragons without dying a single time until maybe the last levels, but this one, I can't even get through the first level. Everybody gangs up on you and they just drain your energy. And yes, even your energy bar goes down faster than in the previous games.
Inherently, it's less fun to go through the same section you've already beaten countless times before.
As seen in this classic NES game, Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis. What? This isn't even the only example of him doing this, by the way, as later on he uses Sonic 2 for B-roll footage.
Make your level designs purposeful, and allow the player to learn about an enemy, item, or obstacle before throwing them into the fray.
And by the way, he does make sure to finish off the trilogy.
There's still some punishment because you lose your checkpoints of the current level, but you don't have to start from scratch, which at the very least saves time, and lets your accomplishments still be worth something.
Kind of odd for a video on NES games to use footage from a series that was exclusive to the Sega Genesis, but I guess it's not super important, just figured it was worthy of pointing out. Now, don't get me wrong, there are other times where he does use B-roll footage from other games that weren't on the NES. However, there it's very obvious he's talking about things not about the NES, like here for example.
Conversely, checkpoints can also feel meaningless if they're too close together or there isn't any punishment for death. A lot of modern games suffer from this, by simply not challenging the player and becoming boring in a different way. So it's a fine balance, but I do like to think that saving progress is better than losing it.
You know, I find it interesting you use DuckTales Remastered footage because the way that game works is if you lose all of your lives, you're sent back to the stage select, putting it on the same level as the Mega Man series, which once again you put in your thumbnail.
But when you fill your later levels with insane reflex challenges and cheap deaths,
yeah, your later levels, like Quickman Stage from Mega Man 2, which could be the first level you play in the game due to Mega Man's stage select mechanic. And again, Mega Man 2 has unlimited continues, so it doesn't even really fall into the category of games you've discussed thus far.
Now, some games fix this issue by having a game over only set you back to the start of the stage, instead of the entire game.
Ghosts and Goblins was more generous than that. You always started at the last checkpoint, even if you were continuing from a game over. Look, I understand I'm harping on this more than a lot of people would. However, the entire point of B-roll footage in videos like this is to show examples of what you're talking about, to give the audience a better understanding of the topic at hand. If the game you're using doesn't actually back up your point, or at the very least has different features than what you're talking about while showing footage of it, I'm going to assume that's you getting the gameplay mechanics wrong, because otherwise, why wouldn't you do the more sensical thing of just putting up a game that actually contains what you're discussing at that point in the video? Essentially, I count it as getting something wrong about the games because otherwise, why would you show this specific game?
And feeling blindsided, like you were cheated out of a life.
As seen here, where you embrace the strategy of running into an enemy and getting hit. Seriously, the only reason why that enemy was a concern to you is because you randomly decided to go left for absolutely no reason whatsoever.
Bottomless pits and one-hit KOs are all over 8-bit titles, and most of the time they're combined with annoying enemies to make it even harder to avoid your demise.
First off, there was no one-hit KO in that Metroid clip you showed, nor any bottomless pits. The lava is not an instant kill. And second off, again, it looked like you just ran into an enemy for no real reason. I don't get your point about annoying enemies because you aren't showing me examples of that. Or at the very least, if you do find this specific part in Metroid annoying, you aren't really communicating why that is to your audience outside of some vague notions, some of which don't even apply to this part of the game.
Add in faulty physics or committed jump arcs, and sometimes your strategy feels more like luck than actual planning.
What luck was required in those Castlevania clips? The first one was you jumping into a bat, although to be fair, I could see you thinking you were jumping over it and just miscalculating how far your jump was or how slow the bat moved in your head. I don't think it's the game's fault, but I at least do understand the rationale there. And the other was you just jumping into some spikes. Both were the result of you not assessing your surroundings properly. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I don't understand why this can be annoying to some. However, there's absolutely no luck involved in it. Anyway, final thoughts. This video got a lot wrong on the topic of NES games. Good night and good luck.